The Zagros mountain range does not look like a command center. That is precisely the point. From any satellite pass, from any reconnaissance aircraft at any altitude, it looks exactly like what it has always been. 500 miles of fractured limestone ridges, deep river canyons, and bare rock plateaus that have absorbed every army since Alexander and given nothing back. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps chose this terrain the same way every serious military planner chooses terrain. Not for what it is, but for what it hides. Buried beneath a specific ridge in the central Zagros, at a depth that its architects calculated with the obsessive precision of people who understood that their lives depended on the number being correct, sat the nerve center of IRGC regional operations. Not a storage facility, not a logistics node, a command and control complex, the place where targeting data was processed, where strike orders originated, where the men who directed proxy networks across 4 countries sat at consoles and moved pieces across a board that spanned the entire Middle East. They had been building it for 11 years. The entrance shafts were disguised as irrigation infrastructure, a network of concrete culverts and drainage channels that satellite imagery analysts had flagged, assessed, and eventually dismissed as agricultural development consistent with the region's water management programs. The deception was deliberate and multi-layered. The drainage channels were real. They functioned exactly as their cover purpose required. The shafts that descended from their floors into the mountain were invisible from above, accessible only from inside structures that appeared, from every available angle, to be water control stations. The complex beneath them was hardened to a standard that exceeded anything the IRGC had previously constructed. Blast doors rated for overpressure events that no conventionally delivered munition could generate at the facility's depth, independent power generation capable of sustaining operations for 60 days without surface contact, a communications infrastructure that routed encrypted traffic through fiber lines buried in the rock and emerging at relay points 40 miles from the complex's actual location. The intelligence picture that established the complex's existence, confirmed its function, and mapped its layout with sufficient precision to support a targeting solution took 3 years and assets that will not be described in any public document for a generation. What it produced, when it was finally complete, was a target folder. And a target folder, in the logic of strategic military planning, is a question waiting for an answer. The answer, when it came, involved 2 aircraft and a weapon that had been designed for exactly this category of problem. The mission launched at 10:22 p.m. from a forward operating location that will not be named here. The 2 B-2 Spirits that lifted off in sequence, separated by an 8-minute interval that placed them far enough apart to present independent radar signatures while keeping them close enough to coordinate weapons employment, carried between them a payload that represented the single most concentrated kinetic capability that American air power could bring to bear on a point target. Each aircraft carried 1 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator in its forward bay, and a targeting pod configuration in the aft station that had been modified for the specific geological profile of the Zagros limestone. The modification was not cosmetic. The fusing algorithms had been recomputed against seismic data from the target area, adjusting the detonation depth parameters to account for the specific density and fracture characteristics of the rock formation above the complex. Someone had done that math. Someone had gotten it right. The mission depended on it. The pilot of the lead aircraft had flown the B-2 for 11 years. He had accumulated more hours in the platform than almost any other aviator in the inventory. And he carried that experience the way a surgeon carries years of identical cuts. Not as pride, but as muscle memory so deep it had stopped being conscious. His pre-flight scan took 4 minutes and 37 seconds. It had taken 4 minutes and 37 seconds for the last 6 years. He found 2 items that required notation. He notated them. Neither was mission critical. He closed his checklist and waited for the clock. The flight to the target area covered a distance that placed the crew at the controls for just over 19 hours before the first weapons release. 19 hours is long enough that the human body begins negotiating with itself about what is necessary and what is optional. Sleep is optional, the body decides, until it isn't. Until the micro-events begin, the 2-second gaps in awareness that leave no memory and no trace except a faint discontinuity in the pilot's internal experience of time passing. The pilot had been briefed on microsleep at altitude. He had studied the physiological literature as part of his extended duration qualification. He had developed a personal counter-rotation every 45 minutes, a sequence of isometric exercises performed in the seat, a controlled breathing cycle borrowed from a diving manual, and a systems check that required active cognitive engagement rather than rote procedure. The system worked. He had never lost a micro-sleep event during a check cycle. He had lost 3 between check cycles in 19 hours and would not know it until the debrief, when the physiological monitoring data from his flight suit was downloaded and the 3 gaps showed up as clean vertical lines in the awareness trace, each less than 2 seconds, none of them near a critical phase of flight. The mountain was still an hour away when the 3rd one occurred. He never felt it happen. The tanker rendezvous that sustained the lead aircraft occurred at 2:51 a.m. over the northern Arabian Sea, a KC-10 extender making the connection in 11 minutes of contact time, despite a crosswind component that pushed both aircraft through a lateral oscillation cycle that the boom operator described in his post-mission report as the most technically demanding transfer he had executed in 4 years on the platform. The oscillation was caused by a weather system that had not appeared in the pre-mission forecast, and that the B-2's onboard weather radar detected at a range close enough that diverting around it was not compatible with the refueling window. The pilot flew through it. The connection held for 9 of the 11 minutes. The remaining 2 minutes were completed on the 2nd attempt, after the boom had disconnected and reseated during a particularly sharp lateral swing that briefly placed the tanker's boom tip 8 feet outside the B-2's receptacle envelope. The fuel transferred. The aircraft continued. The second B-2 made its tanker contact 40 minutes later. Same location, calmer conditions. The mission commander on the trail aircraft noted in his mental log that the weather window had closed between the 2 refueling events and that the lead crew had absorbed the difficult contact without breaking radio silence to report it. He knew they had succeeded because they were still on the data link track. Silence in this context was the most informative communication available. At 4:33 a.m. local time, the lead B-2 crossed into Iranian airspace at an altitude and on a heading that the mission planners had selected after modeling Iranian radar coverage against the B-2's signature for 6 months. The corridor was not a gap in the coverage. There were no gaps. It was a vector through the coverage that minimized the probability of detection below a threshold the planners had assessed as operationally acceptable. A phrase that translated from planning language into operational reality meant if the aircraft was detected on this vector, the detection would occur late enough and at a range short enough that no intercept could be positioned in time. The assessment was based on known system parameters, known response times, and a known order of battle. It was correct in every particular except one. The one particular it did not account for was a mobile radar unit, an older Kashef-1 surveillance system mounted on a commercial flatbed truck that had repositioned from its mapped location 48 hours before the mission and parked on a ridge that placed it 11 miles inside the planned penetration corridor. The unit was not part of the integrated air defense network. It was a Guard Corps asset, operated by a signals team that ran it semi-independently and reported its data through a separate command chain that did not feed directly into the national air defense picture. It had repositioned because the team leader, acting on a standing order to vary patrol routes on a randomized schedule, had picked this ridge from a grid square on a planning map without knowing that his choice placed his antenna directly in the approach path of the most capable stealth aircraft on the planet. The Kashef-1's radar was not sophisticated enough to generate a weapons-quality track on the B-2. What it generated at 4:41 a.m. were 4 consecutive returns on a frequency band that the B-2's passive warning system classified as a low-probability detection event. Not enough signal fidelity for the Iranian operator to know what he was looking at, but enough anomaly to register on his screen as something that was not clutter. The operator reported the anomalous return to his duty officer. The duty officer, trained to treat unexplained returns in a heightened threat environment with disciplined skepticism. A discipline that had been reinforced repeatedly in the preceding months as false alerts had degraded operator confidence in marginal contacts. Assessed the return as likely clutter, noted it in the log, and did not forward it up the chain. He would replay that decision for the rest of his life. The lead B-2's defensive management system flagged the Kashef-1 emission at 4:41 a.m. and presented the pilot with a threat symbol that he had not seen on a live mission before. He recognized it from the electronic order of battle briefing. He made the assessment in the time it takes to draw one breath. The system was not in a weapons guidance mode, the emission was not tracking, and deviation from the planned attack route at this stage would compromise the weapon's release geometry in ways that could not be corrected in the time remaining before the release window. He held his heading. His right hand rested on the throttle. He held his heading and flew through the emission cone and out the other side, and at 4:43 a.m. the threat symbol dropped off his display as the geometry between the radar and the aircraft moved beyond effective range. 8 seconds later, he exhaled. He had not been aware he was holding his breath. The integrated air defense picture that covered the target area, the layered S-300 and Bavar 373 batteries that ringed the Zagros approach sectors, the shorter-range rod systems positioned on the ridge lines closest to the suspected facility area, the Hawk batteries that had been continuously operational since 1979 and were maintained by technicians who knew their systems the way a musician knows an instrument, received its electronic suppression at 4:39 a.m. before the lead aircraft entered the defended zone, from a combination of sources that the planners had assembled with the specific purpose of creating a 3-minute window. 3 minutes was the weapons release timeline. 3 minutes was all that was required. The EA-18G Growlers that provided the jamming were operating from international airspace over the Gulf. Their reach into the Iranian interior was at the maximum effective range of their systems, which meant the jamming was not clean. At maximum range, the ALQ-99 pods produce a coverage pattern that is broader and less precisely shaped than at closer engagement ranges. Effective at the target frequency bands, but not immune to the kind of boundary effects that allow a receiver at the edge of the coverage zone to detect signal anomalies that indicate active jamming. The Bavar 373 battery positioned on the ridge northwest of the target area detected the jamming signature at 4:42 a.m. Its fire control system switched to its home-on-jam mode, a capability that uses the jamming signal itself as a targeting beacon, and began tracking the Growler formation. This was expected. The Growlers were prepared for it. The two FA-18E Super Hornets that had been holding at medium altitude, 40 miles behind the Growler track, received the home-on jam alert through the data link and began a coordinated jamming suppression sequence that occupied the Bavar 373 fire control radar with a false target generated from two independent angles. The system attempted to resolve the track ambiguity between the genuine Growler formation and the two false targets. During the 14 seconds it spent in track resolution mode, it was not guiding missiles. Those 14 seconds were inside the 3-minute window. The window held. At 4:44 a.m., the lead B-2 reached the initial point. The weapons bay doors opened. The GBU-57 released from the forward station. The aircraft climbed at the rate that the sudden departure of 15 tons of weapon produced, and the pilot corrected the pitch attitude with an input so practiced it registered on the control surface position recorder as a single smooth deflection rather than a correction. The bomb bay doors closed. The aircraft was already turning. The weapon followed a terminal guidance solution that had been computed against the seismic adjusted fuzing algorithm developed over 3 months by a team of engineers who had never been told the name of the target country and would not be told for 2 years. It struck the rock surface above the complex at 4:44 a.m. and 38 seconds. The nose cone, machined from steel alloy to a hardness specification that exists at the boundary of what manufacturing technology can reliably produce, drove into the limestone at a velocity that transferred its kinetic energy into the rock formation in a sequence that the engineers had modeled and the rock had not been consulted about. The penetration proceeded through the upper limestone layers, through a clay interbed that the Geological Survey had identified and that the fusing algorithm had been specifically adjusted to account for, and into the harder limestone substrate above the complex ceiling. The fuse counted deceleration pulses. When the count reached the threshold that the algorithm defined as the optimal detonation depth, it fired. The overpressure that reached the command complex arrived from below and from the sides simultaneously, channeled by the rock formation in ways that the complex's blast engineers had not modeled because they had designed against threats arriving from above. The primary communications vault, the hardened room that housed the encrypted routing equipment for all outbound traffic, lost structural integrity in the first quarter second. The backup power generator sustained a fuel line fracture that caused an immediate shutdown rather than the graceful transition to battery power that the design required. The blast doors held. The personnel inside them were uninjured. The facility they were protecting was no longer a facility. The Trail B-2 reached its release point 11 minutes after the lead aircraft, by which time the dust column from the first weapon's impact had reached an altitude visible on the infrared sensors. The trail aircraft's GBU-57 followed the cavity opened by the first weapon to a greater depth, its modified fusing algorithm computing the changed density profile of the post-impact rock formation in real time and adjusting detonation depth accordingly. The secondary detonation reached the complex's lower level. The command processing floor that had been built deeper than the primary level, specifically to survive a scenario in which the upper level was compromised. The design philosophy had been correct. The depth had been insufficient. At 5:03 a.m., the surface garrison at the facility's nearest disguised entrance reported that all contact with the underground complex had been severed. Radio, landline, intercom. The duty officer at the surface attempted the manual knock protocol, a physical signal system using a vibration transmitter mounted in the entrance shaft. A system so primitive that it had been included in the design as a last resort option that the engineers assumed would never be needed. He activated the transmitter. He waited the prescribed response interval. The shaft returned silence. He activated it again. The shaft returned silence. He picked up the external line and began making calls to a chain of command that would spend the next 3 hours processing the implications of what had happened in 38 seconds of weapons employment. The two B-2s were 400 miles into their egress when the garrison duty officer made his first external call. They flew in the same silence they had maintained since takeoff, separated by the same interval, their data links carrying encrypted confirmation codes that told the mission planners everything that needed to be known. The trail aircraft's mission commander removed his right glove and pressed his palm flat against the instrument panel for 3 seconds. A private ritual with no tactical significance, a gesture that meant something only to him, developed over years of flying missions that carried the weight of irreversible decisions. He put his glove back on. He began the fuel calculation for the next refueling window, the numbers that closed the mission package. 19 hours and 4 minutes of flight time for the lead aircraft. 2 GBU-57 penetrators employed in an 11-minute interval. 0 radar tracks generated in the integrated Iranian air defense network. 1 mobile radar anomaly detected, reported, and assessed as clutter by an Iranian duty officer whose procedural caution, disciplined and reasonable by every standard of his training, was the single decision point where the mission's invisibility was closest to failing. 3 minutes of electronic warfare window maintained against a reactive air defense that adapted faster than the pre-mission modeling had predicted. 0 aircraft lost. The command complex that had coordinated regional operations across 4 countries for 11 years was rendered permanently inoperable before the garrison on the surface understood that anything had happened. What is built in secret must eventually be tested in secret. The men who spent 11 years constructing an indestructible command center believed they were building permanence into unstable terrain. They built well. They built deep. They built against every threat they knew. The threat they did not know had been studying them since the first culvert was poured. When the mountain absorbs something, it absorbs it completely. The silence it returns is the only answer that matters.